Imagine this. You're standing by a river in ancient Mesopotamia, thousands of years ago. The water looks calm, maybe even refreshing, but it's filled with dirt, animal waste, parasites, and bacteria. There are no filters, no bottled water, no chlorine. Yet, people drank it every single day. And somehow, many of them survived. How? The truth is, ancient people weren't ignorant. They knew water could make them sick. Civilizations developed clever tricks to make water safer, even if they didn't understand germs the way we do today. In Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, the most common solution was turning water into beer. Beer wasn't just a drink for fun, it was survival. Barley was boiled during brewing, which killed off many harmful organisms. The alcohol content was low, but enough to stop dangerous bacteria from spreading. That's why even children drank beer. For Egyptians, beer was so essential that workers who built the pyramids were often paid in bread and beer. Other cultures used wine mixed with water. The Greeks and Romans believed it was barbaric to drink pure water. They always diluted it with wine, which acted as a disinfectant. For them, wine was a medicine, a purifier, and a daily necessity. But what about places without beer or wine? People came up with even more resourceful methods. In India and China, people boiled their water for tea long before they understood microbes. The simple act of boiling was one of humanity's greatest defenses against disease. In some regions, people also relied on natural filters. They would pour water through sand, gravel, or cloth to remove dirt. Some would store water in clay jars, letting sediment sink to the bottom. Even activated charcoal, which we use in modern filters, was discovered by accident when water stored with burned wood tasted cleaner. Still, not everyone survived. Many children died from contaminated water, and plagues often spread through rivers. Yet, by trial and error, ancient societies figured out which sources were safer. Springs and wells were usually preferred over rivers. In fact, some Roman cities built massive aqueducts to bring cleaner water from mountain springs directly into the city. So, how did people drink dirty water without dying? The truth is, they didn't always escape sickness. But beer, wine, boiling, filtering, and clever storage gave them a fighting chance. And without those survival tricks, entire civilizations might never have lasted.
Imagine a world without central heating. No electric blankets, no radiators. Winter nights were long, cold, and often deadly. Yet for thousands of years, people managed to survive bitter winds, snow, and freezing temperatures. How? The answer lies in fire, clever clothing, and some surprising tricks. The first and most important tool was fire. From the moment humans learned to control flames, it became the difference between life and death. Families gathered around hearths inside their homes. In Mesopotamia, houses were built with thick mud brick walls that trapped heat while fires burned in clay stoves. In colder regions like Northern Europe, people built homes partially underground, using the earth itself as insulation. But fire alone wasn't enough. Clothing was their second shield. Ancient people layered animal skins, furs, and wool to create insulation. In colder climates, nomads like the Scythians and Mongols wore thick coats of sheepskin and boots stuffed with fur. In the Alps, even Otzi the Iceman, whose frozen body was discovered after 5,000 years, wore multiple layers of leather, grass insulation, and a fur cloak. Clothing was survival gear, not fashion. Another secret weapon was body heat. Families didn't sleep in separate rooms like we do today. Instead, they huddled together in a single space. Children, parents, even animals often shared the same sleeping area. Imagine a family lying side by side on mats, wrapped in blankets of wool or hides, with dogs or sheep nearby adding warmth. Architecture also played a role. In Rome, wealthy citizens enjoyed hypocaust systems, an early form of central heating where hot air from a fire flowed under the floors and through the walls. The poor, however, relied on simple braziers, metal bowls filled with burning charcoal, though these came with the risk of deadly smoke. In northern villages, people used thatched roofs, small windows, and thick walls to conserve every bit of heat. Some dug smoke holes to trap warmth while letting out just enough fumes to avoid suffocation. And then there were the little tricks. People slept with hot stones wrapped in cloth to keep warm. They stuffed straw into mattresses and clothing for extra insulation. They learned to drink warm broths, fermented drinks, and herbal teas that heated the body from within. Of course, survival wasn't easy. Winters still killed thousands. Crops failed, food ran out, and frostbite was common. But through fire, fur, family warmth, and clever homes, ancient people endured winters that would send most of us running for central heating today.
Today, we take toothpaste, toothbrushes, and dentists for granted. But imagine living thousands of years ago. No minty gels, no floss, no dentists with drills. Yet people still cared about their teeth. Rotten teeth meant pain, infection, and sometimes even death. So how did ancient people keep their mouths clean? One of the oldest tools was the chew stick. In Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and China, people used small twigs from certain trees. They chewed the ends until they frayed into bristles, then rubbed them against their teeth. Some trees, like the Salvadora persica, still used today in parts of the world, had natural antibacterial properties, acting like early toothpaste and mouthwash combined. The Egyptians were among the first to invent a form of toothpaste powder. Archaeologists found recipes made of crushed rock salt, pepper, dried flowers, and even burnt eggshells. People dipped a damp stick into the powder and scrubbed their teeth. It wasn't pleasant, gritty, spicy, and harsh on the gums, but it worked. Later, Romans made their own version, mixing charcoal, crushed bones, and oyster shells into a rough paste. Some even added honey or urine. Yes, urine, because they believed it whitened teeth. In Greece, Hippocrates, the famous physician, recommended a dental paste made from vinegar, pumice stone, and salt. In India, Ayurveda texts described chewing aromatic sticks of neem or acacia, which freshened breath and cleaned teeth. People also used cloth or fingers to rub away food particles. Even without toothpaste, the simple mechanical action of scrubbing helped prevent buildup. Some cultures rinsed with salt water, vinegar, or herbal concoctions to disinfect the mouth. But it wasn't always enough. Ancient skeletons show plenty of cavities, abscesses, and worn enamel. Without modern dentistry, toothaches were common, and extractions, often done with crude tools, were the only solution. Yet the fact that people across the ancient world developed so many methods shows just how important oral hygiene was. So while we squeeze minty paste from a tube today, our ancestors brushed with twigs, bones, ashes, and even powders from shells. It might sound rough, but for them, it was the difference between keeping a tooth or losing it. When you picture cooking today, you probably imagine a kitchen. Stoves, pans, knives, maybe even a microwave. But in ancient times, none of that existed. So, how did people prepare their food? The answer is a story of fire, earth, stone, and ingenuity. The earliest kitchens were nothing more than fire pits. People dug shallow holes in the ground, filled them with wood, and let the flames burn down into glowing embers. Then they placed meat, roots, or grains directly onto the coals, or wrapped them in leaves and buried them under hot ash. It was slow cooking at its most primitive, smoky, uneven, but effective. As civilizations grew, cooking became more sophisticated.
In Mesopotamia, families used clay ovens called tanurs. These were round, beehive-shaped structures made of mud or brick. People stuck flatbreads to the hot inner walls, letting them bake until golden. Archaeologists even found ancient recipes for stews and soups written on clay tablets, proving that people were boiling meats, grains, and vegetables in clay pots thousands of years ago. In Egypt, open fires were still common, but wealthier households had stone hearths with bronze or copper pots. Bread was the staple, so almost every home had grinding stones for flour. Baking wasn't just for survival, it was an art, and different kinds of bread symbolized status and ritual. The Greeks loved their outdoor cooking. They grilled fish and meat on skewers over coals, and used simple clay stoves that could be carried to different places. The Romans later perfected this with their portable braziers, metal containers filled with hot coals, which allowed cooking inside apartments where full fires were too dangerous. For nomadic tribes, cooking was always about mobility. They roasted meat on open flames, boiled broth in animal skin bags, and sometimes used heated stones dropped into water-filled containers to cook soups without metal pots. Imagine boiling a stew by tossing red-hot rocks into a hide bag. It sounds primitive, but it worked. Spices, oils, and herbs slowly transformed meals from simple survival food into something flavorful. Trade routes brought cinnamon, pepper, and saffron across continents, and the wealthy showed off with elaborate feasts. But for most people, cooking remained basic: bread, porridge, roasted vegetables, dried meat, and stew. So while we rely on gas, electricity, and appliances, ancient people cooked with earthen ovens, clay pots, glowing coals, and clever stone tools. No kitchens, no chef's knives, just fire, creativity, and necessity.
Imagine a world without electricity. Once the sun set, darkness swallowed everything. Yet ancient people still worked, told stories, cooked, and prayed after sundown. How did they bring light into the night? The oldest and simplest answer was fire. A burning log in the hearth was the heart of the home. It gave warmth, protection, and just enough light to move around. But carrying a log from room to room wasn't practical. People needed something smaller, something portable. That's where torches came in. Bundles of sticks wrapped with resin or cloth soaked in fat could burn for hours. They were cheap, bright, and simple to make. Soldiers carried them on night patrols. Travelers lit their way with them, and festivals were often illuminated with great lines of torches. But they smoked heavily, filled the air with soot, and weren't safe indoors. Inside homes, the most common solution was the oil lamp. Archaeologists have found countless clay lamps, some plain and some decorated with intricate designs. These lamps were filled with olive oil or animal fat, with a linen wick that drew up the fuel. A single lamp could glow for hours, giving off a soft yellow light. Wealthy Romans sometimes filled lamps with expensive perfumes, so the room smelled sweet as it lit up. Candles came later, around the Roman era, but they weren't common at first. Early candles were made from tallow, a form of animal fat, which smelled awful when burned. Beeswax candles were far superior, clean, bright, and fragrant, but they were so expensive that only the rich or the temples could afford them. In colder, darker regions, people relied on open braziers of glowing charcoal, which provided both heat and light. Others used pine knots, resin-soaked wood that blazed brightly and cheaply.
In some cultures, shells were filled with fish oil and lit with plant fibers, creating simple lamps by the sea. Of course, night was still dangerous. Light was dim, shadows flickered, and lamps often went out in the wind. Whole cities grew quiet after sundown. Only guards, travelers, and thieves dared to move under the weak glow of torches. So how did ancient people light their homes at night? With torches, oil lamps, tallow candles, and glowing embers. Small flames that pushed back just enough darkness to keep life going until sunrise.
Today, most of us sink into mattresses filled with springs, memory foam, or feathers. But in the ancient world, beds as we know them barely existed. So how did people sleep? For the poor and working classes, the answer was simple: the floor. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, families spread out mats woven from reeds or straw. These mats were rolled up in the morning and used again at night. Sometimes, people just lay on the bare ground with a simple blanket or animal hide to keep them warm. In colder climates, straw was a lifesaver. People stuffed sacks with dried straw, grass, or leaves to create crude mattresses. It wasn't comfortable. Straw poked, shifted, and attracted insects, but it insulated against the chill of stone or dirt floors. To make things softer, some layered furs or wool blankets on top. The wealthy, of course, had more options. In Egypt, nobles slept on wooden bed frames, often raised off the floor to avoid pests. These beds were simple but elegant, sometimes carved with animal legs and stretched with woven cords or leather strips. In Greece and Rome, wealthier households had couches and wooden bedsteads, piled with cushions stuffed with wool or feathers. Still, even the richest beds were nothing like modern mattresses. Another big difference: sleeping positions and spaces. Most families slept together in a single room. Children, parents, even servants sometimes shared the same sleeping area. In colder regions, animals often slept indoors too, adding body heat to the room. Privacy wasn't part of ancient sleep, survival was. In some cultures, people even slept in shifts. In the Middle Ages and earlier, there's evidence of first sleep and second sleep. People went to bed after sunset, woke around midnight for prayers, chores, or even intimacy, and then went back to sleep until dawn. Pillows were another luxury. The Egyptians often used headrests made of carved wood or stone, shaped like a curved block to support the neck. They weren't soft at all, but they kept the head elevated and cool in hot nights. In Asia, porcelain pillows served a similar role. Only the wealthy could afford soft cushions filled with feathers. So how did people sleep without beds? On mats, straw sacks, or the bare ground? With family, with animals, with the flicker of a dying fire for light? Comfort was rare. Survival was everything.
Imagine a world without flush toilets, without plumbing, without even toilet paper. How did ancient people deal with one of life's most basic needs? For most, the answer was simple: nature itself. People relieved themselves outdoors, in fields, behind bushes, or in pits dug into the ground. Rural communities often used communal latrine pits, which were later covered over with soil once they filled. Privacy was rare, and the smell was part of daily life. In cities, the problem grew bigger. Ancient Mesopotamia had some of the earliest toilets, clay or brick seats placed above deep pits. In wealthy households, some even had rudimentary drainage systems, where waste was flushed away with water from nearby rivers or wells. But this was only for the privileged few. The Romans took things much further. They built massive public latrines, stone benches with rows of holes cut into them, often seating dozens of people at once. Beneath ran flowing water to carry waste away. But here's the strange part: there were no dividers. People sat side by side, chatting, doing business, and sharing the experience. Hygiene? By today's standards, shocking. Instead of toilet paper, Romans used a sponge on a stick called a tersorium, rinsed in a bucket of salty water and shared by everyone in the latrine. In Egypt, poorer people simply used sand pits, while wealthier households had limestone toilet seats set above containers that servants later emptied. In medieval Europe, chamber pots became common, simple ceramic or wooden bowls kept under the bed. At night, people would use them and then dump the contents into the street the next morning. In crowded cities, entire neighborhoods reeked. Castles had their own solution, the garderobe. These were small stone rooms with a hole in a wooden bench built into the castle wall. Waste dropped directly into the moat or into pits below. Not the most sanitary setup, but it kept things out of the living quarters. As for cleaning, people improvised. Ancient Greeks and Romans sometimes used broken pieces of pottery as scrapers. In Asia, smooth bamboo sticks, cloth, or water from nearby jars were common. Leaves, moss, and even handfuls of snow were used in colder places. Toilet paper as we know it wasn't invented until much later in China, around the 6th century AD. So how did ancient people go to the toilet without bathrooms? With pits, pots, benches, sponges in the open air. It wasn't private, it wasn't clean, but it was the reality of daily life.
Cleanliness has always been important, but for most of history, people had no soap, no shampoo, and no hot showers. So how did they wash? In ancient Egypt, people bathed in the Nile or in clay basins. Instead of soap, they used natron, a natural salt mixed with oils. This scrubbed dirt away and even helped fight bacteria. Wealthy Egyptians applied perfumed oils afterward to mask odors in the desert heat. The Greeks and Romans took bathing to another level. Public bathhouses had pools of hot and cold water, steam rooms, and massage areas. But they didn't use soap either. Instead, they rubbed their skin with oil, then scraped it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil, removing sweat and dirt together. It was more than hygiene. It was a social event. In colder regions like Northern Europe, full baths were rare. People washed with steam baths, rivers, or even just a wet cloth. Vikings bathed weekly, which shocked their European neighbors, who often went much longer without washing. They also combed their hair daily and used herbs to fight body odor. In India, ritual bathing in rivers was common, while in Japan, hot springs or onsen were used for purification as well as relaxation. These traditions were about both body and spirit. The first true soaps came later, when people discovered that mixing animal fat with ashes made a cleaning paste. Early versions were harsh and used mostly for laundry, not the body. So how did people wash without soap? With water, oil scrapers, sand, herbs, and hot springs. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to keep ancient people alive and somewhat clean in a world without modern hygiene. Shaving today is easy. A razor, some cream, and you're done. But in ancient times, people still cared about their beards, hair, and appearance. Without modern blades, how did they shave? The earliest razors date back thousands of years. Archaeologists have found sharp flint blades used by prehistoric people to scrape away hair. They weren't smooth or safe. Imagine dragging a piece of sharp stone across your face. Cuts and infections were common, but it worked. As metalworking advanced, people crafted copper and bronze razors. Egyptians, who valued smooth, clean-shaven heads for both fashion and hygiene, used curved bronze blades. Priests even shaved their entire bodies as a sign of purity. Wealthy men hired barbers to keep their heads and faces smooth, while commoners did it themselves with crude tools. The Romans also loved barbers. Public barbershops were popular meeting places where men shaved, had their beards trimmed, and caught up on gossip.
They used iron razors and tweezers, sometimes heated to sterilize them. Still, the blades were nowhere near as sharp as modern razors, so shaving was slow and painful. In many cultures, shaving wasn't always about vanity. It was survival. In hot climates, removing hair helped fight lice and stay cool. In the military, soldiers often shaved to avoid enemies grabbing their beards in battle. Not everyone shaved, though. Some cultures preferred long beards as a sign of wisdom, masculinity, or power. Ancient Greeks admired philosophers with beards, while Vikings and Celts wore theirs proudly. Shaving or not shaving often reflected status and culture as much as personal preference. For those who couldn't shave, plucking was another method. Tweezers made from shells, bronze, or bone were used to painfully pull out hairs one by one. In some cases, people even burned hair off with hot coals. Harsh, but effective. So how did ancient people shave without razors, with sharpened stones, bronze blades, iron knives, and even fire? Painful, risky, but part of daily life in a world where appearance mattered as much as survival.
Today, a quick trip to the barber means sharp scissors, buzzing clippers, and clean styles. But in ancient times, scissors as we know them didn't exist. So how did people cut their hair? The earliest method was simple: sharp stones or flint knives. Prehistoric people chipped flint into razor-like edges, then hacked or sawed through hair. It wasn't neat, it wasn't stylish, but it shortened hair enough to keep it manageable. Later, as metalworking advanced, people used bronze and iron blades. These weren't scissors yet, but small knives, razors, or shears shaped like pincers. Ancient Egyptians, for example, often shaved their heads entirely to avoid lice in the hot climate, using curved bronze razors to scrape hair away. Wigs then replaced natural hair for both fashion and hygiene. By the time of the Romans and Greeks, barbershops had become important community hubs. Instead of scissors, barbers used single-bladed knives and shears to cut hair. Shears looked more like giant tweezers than modern scissors, two connected blades squeezed together to snip hair. Different cultures had different traditions. In China, barbers used small knives to shave heads smooth, while in India, ritual head shaving was often performed with sharp razors during religious ceremonies. Among Vikings and Celts, warriors kept long hair and beards but trimmed them roughly with knives. Styles weren't always precise, but they carried deep cultural meaning. In poorer households, hair was often cut at home, not for style, but for survival. Long hair attracted lice, fleas, and disease. Parents trimmed their children's hair with simple knives, or even burned it off at the ends to prevent infestations. So how did ancient people cut their hair without scissors? With sharp stones, bronze razors, iron knives, and primitive shears. The cuts weren't always straight, but hair care was more about hygiene, ritual, and status than fashion.
At every meal today, forks, knives, and spoons feel natural. But for most of history, people ate without forks at all. So how did they do it? The simplest answer? Their hands. In ancient times, food was often cooked in ways that made it easy to grab. Bread, stews, roasted meat, fruits, and vegetables. People tore food apart with their fingers, dipped bread into sauces, and scooped from shared bowls. In fact, eating with hands is still traditional in many cultures today, from India to Ethiopia, with rules of cleanliness and etiquette. The spoon was the first real utensil, appearing thousands of years ago. Egyptians carved spoons from wood and ivory. Greeks and Romans had metal spoons, sometimes decorated, used for soups or porridges. But solid foods were still eaten by hand. Knives also played a big role. People carried personal knives everywhere, not just for hunting or work, but for cutting meat at meals. Instead of table sets, guests used their own knives to slice portions from the communal dish. Forks existed in the ancient world, but only as cooking tools, not eating utensils. The Byzantines began using small two-pronged forks at the table around the 7th to 9th centuries, but Europeans considered them strange and even unnecessary. In medieval Europe, when forks slowly spread, some people mocked them as unmanly. It wasn't until the Renaissance that forks became common in dining halls. So, how did people manage without forks? They ate with their hands, spoons, knives, and bread, which doubled as both utensil and plate. Meals were less about individual portions and more about sharing. It might sound messy, but it was normal, communal, and part of the experience of eating together.
Refrigerators are modern miracles. Today, we take for granted that meat stays fresh for days, but in ancient times, without electricity or cold storage, keeping meat from rotting was a constant struggle. So how did they do it? One of the oldest and most effective methods was drying. People cut meat into thin strips and hung it in the sun or over low fires until the moisture evaporated. This created early forms of jerky that could last weeks or even months. In deserts and hot climates, drying was the main method of survival. Another crucial technique was salting. Salt pulls moisture out of meat, making it impossible for bacteria to grow. Civilizations that controlled salt, like the Romans, Chinese, and Incas, could preserve food for their armies and travelers. Salted fish, pork, and beef became staples across the ancient world. In colder regions, people turned to smoking. Meat hung above slow-burning fires absorbed smoke, which both dried it and coated it in chemicals that prevented decay. Smoked hams, sausages, and fish were common from Northern Europe to the Americas. Where climates allowed, people used ice and snow. Wealthy families in Persia, China, and later Europe built ice houses, underground chambers filled with blocks of ice harvested in winter, insulated with straw. These natural refrigerators kept meat cool through the summer. Fermentation was another trick. Some cultures intentionally let meat or fish ferment, creating strong-smelling but long-lasting foods. Scandinavians still eat surströmming, fermented herring, a survival food from ancient times. In emergencies, meat was simply eaten immediately. Animals were slaughtered only when a community was ready to consume most of it. Nothing went to waste. Fresh cuts were roasted, organs cooked at once, and the rest dried, salted, or smoked. So how did people preserve meat without fridges? With drying, salting, smoking, ice houses, and fermentation. Clever methods that turned fragile meat into survival food for weeks, months, or even years.
Bread is one of humanity's oldest and most universal foods. But ovens, as we know them, were rare luxuries. So how did ancient people make bread without them? Earliest breads were flatbreads, simple mixtures of crushed grains and water. People spread the dough on hot stones placed near a fire. The heat baked the thin dough quickly, creating chewy, smoky bread. This method was used by hunter-gatherers long before cities existed. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, people developed clay griddles and simple hearths. Dough was flattened and slapped onto the sides of heated clay walls, producing soft breads similar to modern naan or pita. Archaeologists have found bread ovens in Egypt dating back over 5,000 years. But most common people relied on open fires and hot surfaces at home. Nomadic groups cooked bread directly in ashes and embers. They buried dough in the coals, then brushed off the ash once it baked through. This ash bread was smoky, rustic, and surprisingly effective. Variations of it still exist today in many cultures. In Rome, wealthier citizens had access to public bakeries. Bakers used large clay or stone ovens to mass-produce loaves, but ordinary families without ovens still made flatbreads over their fires. Bread was so important that the government distributed it to citizens as part of daily rations. Other civilizations got creative. In South America, early peoples made corn flatbreads, like tortillas, on hot stones. In Asia, rice and millet cakes were steamed or pan-fried, requiring no oven at all. So how did people make bread without ovens? With hot stones, clay griddles, fire pits, and ashes. The result wasn't fluffy loaves like today, but flat, hearty breads that fueled armies, farmers, and entire civilizations.
Today, we drink beer for fun, for taste, for celebration. But in ancient times, beer wasn't just a luxury. It was a survival tool. For many people, beer was safer to drink than water. Why? Because most natural water sources were contaminated. Rivers and wells were filled with dirt, waste, and parasites. Drinking straight water often meant sickness or death. But when people brewed beer, the process of boiling, fermenting, and adding grains killed harmful bacteria. The result? A safe, nourishing drink. The earliest evidence of beer dates back over 7,000 years in Mesopotamia. Sumerians brewed it from barley, creating a thick, porridge-like drink. They even worshipped a goddess of beer, Ninkasi, and sang hymns praising the drink that gladdens the heart. Beer wasn't just for parties. It was daily nutrition. In Egypt, workers who built the pyramids were paid in bread and beer rations. A typical laborer might drink up to 4 liters a day. The beer was low in alcohol, full of calories, and packed with vitamins from the grains. It was food and water in one. In Europe, medieval peasants relied on small beer, weakly brewed beer with just enough alcohol to keep it safe from contamination. Even children drank it. Monks in monasteries brewed stronger versions, both for themselves and for trade, making beer a cornerstone of medieval life. Of course, brewing wasn't the same everywhere. In South America, the Incas brewed chicha from fermented corn. In Africa, people brewed millet and sorghum beers. In Asia, rice-based brews were common. Every culture had its own recipe, shaped by the grains they grew. So, why did ancient people drink beer instead of water? Because it was safe, nutritious, and reliable. Beer wasn't just a drink. It was life itself, fueling workers, farmers, and entire civilizations.
Today, salt is cheap and everywhere, but in the ancient world, salt was so valuable it was sometimes called white gold. People needed it to survive, not just for flavor, but to preserve food, heal wounds, and keep the body alive. The big question is, how did they get it? The simplest method was evaporation. Coastal communities collected seawater in shallow ponds. Over days or weeks, the sun evaporated the water, leaving behind salt crystals. This worked best in hot climates like Egypt, Greece, and Rome. In other places, salt came from mines. Underground deposits of rock salt were hacked out with picks and carried to the surface. Some of these mines, like those in Hallstatt, Austria, have been worked for over 3,000 years. Mining was dangerous, caves collapsed, and workers often suffocated, but the reward was priceless. Another method was boiling brine. In regions without seawater, people found natural salt springs, where underground deposits dissolved into water. They collected the brine and boiled it down in clay pots or iron cauldrons, leaving pure salt behind.
This technique was common in China and parts of Europe. Salt was so important that it fueled trade routes and empires. In Africa, caravans carried blocks of salt across the Sahara Desert, trading them for gold. In China, dynasties taxed salt heavily, making it one of the most profitable state monopolies in history. Even the Roman word salarium, payment in salt, is the origin of our word salary. Salt wasn't just about cooking, it was about power. Civilizations rose and fell around who controlled it. Armies marched with it, and entire cities were built near salt sources. So how did ancient people get salt? From the sea, from mines, from springs, and from the sweat of countless workers who risked their lives to harvest humanity's most essential mineral.
Imagine wanting to make dinner, but there's no frying pan, no pot, not even a clay bowl. For much of human history, that was normal. People had to be creative to cook their food without the metal or ceramic cookware we take for granted today. One of the oldest methods was cooking directly on fire. Meat was skewered on sticks or laid across hot embers to roast. This gave smoky flavors and crispy textures. Think of it as the world's first barbecue. Another technique was stone cooking. People heated flat stones in a fire until they glowed hot, then placed food directly on them, much like a primitive griddle. Some tribes dropped heated stones into water-filled pits dug in the ground. The stones boiled the water, allowing them to stew meat or soften roots without any pot. In some regions, especially the Pacific Islands, people used earth ovens. A pit was dug, lined with hot stones, and layered with leaves. Meat, fish, and vegetables were placed inside, then covered with more leaves and earth. Hours later, the food emerged tender and juicy, slow cooking at its finest. People also used animal parts as containers. Stomachs, hides, or shells were filled with water and food, then placed near fire with hot stones dropped inside to cook everything slowly. It was surprisingly effective and left no waste. Clay itself was another solution. Before ceramic pots existed, food could be wrapped in wet clay and placed in fire. When the clay hardened and cracked, it peeled away, leaving roasted meat inside, an ancient foil wrap. So, without pots and pans, people turned the natural world into their kitchen. Fire, stone, earth, leaves, and even animal skins. Cooking wasn't just survival, it was ingenuity at its most primal. Long before rifles and bullets, humans had to rely on their strength, patience, and clever tools to hunt. Hunting was survival. It meant food, clothing, tools, and even protection. But how did people catch animals without guns? The earliest method was persistence hunting. Our ancestors would chase animals for hours, even days, until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. Humans can't run the fastest, but we can sweat and keep going. This endurance gave early hunters a huge advantage. Then came spears. Sharpened sticks hardened in fire were used to stab or throw at animals. Later, stone tips were added, making them deadlier. With teamwork, groups of hunters could bring down even large game like mammoths. Another leap was the bow and arrow. First appearing at least 60,000 years ago, bows gave hunters range, speed, and stealth. With poison-tipped arrows, often made from plant toxins or snake venom, even a small wound could kill. But hunting wasn't only about weapons, it was about traps and tricks. People dug pits camouflaged with leaves, where animals would fall in. They used snares, nets, and deadfall traps to catch smaller creatures. Some tribes even stampeded herds off cliffs in a coordinated chase, collecting the meat afterward.
Hunting also relied on decoys and lures. Bird hunters used whistles that mimicked calls, while fishermen carved fake bait or used shiny stones to attract fish. Camouflage, using mud, leaves, or animal skins, made hunters blend into their surroundings. Dogs, domesticated around 15,000 years ago, became essential partners. They tracked, chased, and cornered prey, making hunting faster and more reliable. So, without guns, ancient people used their endurance, teamwork, simple tools, and intelligence to turn the wild into their pantry. Hunting was never easy. It demanded skill, risk, and respect for nature.
Today, tractors, plows, and harvesters do most of the heavy lifting. But for thousands of years, farming was powered by nothing more than human muscle, simple tools, and sometimes animals. So how did people grow food without machines? The earliest farmers began with digging sticks, pointed wooden poles to poke holes in the soil for seeds. Later, stone or bone hoes helped break the ground. Over time, these evolved into the plow. At first, it was just a wooden frame dragged by hand. Later, animals like oxen and horses were harnessed to pull heavier plows, opening more land for crops. Irrigation was another breakthrough. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, people dug canals and ditches to guide river water into their fields. In the Andes, farmers carved terraces into steep mountainsides to trap rainwater and create flatland for crops. Every drop of water was precious. Fertilizer wasn't chemical, but natural. Farmers used animal manure, ash from fires, and composted plants to enrich the soil. Some cultures, like the indigenous peoples of the Americas, buried fish beneath corn seeds, a natural boost of nutrients. Planting and harvesting were done by hand. People bent over for hours, planting seed by seed, then cutting crops with flint sickles, bronze blades, or later iron scythes. Families and entire villages worked together during harvest season because speed was vital before the weather ruined the crop. Farmers also relied on the sky. They watched the stars, the moon, and the seasons to know when to plant and when to harvest. Without machines, their best tool was knowledge passed down through generations. Farming without machines was backbreaking, time-consuming, and uncertain, but it was also the foundation of civilization. Without those early farmers, cities, trade, and culture would never have existed.
Today, baby bottles, formula, and sterilized nipples are standard. But in ancient times, mothers and families had to care for infants with little more than what nature and ingenuity provided. So how did they feed babies without modern bottles? The most common answer was simple: breastfeeding. For most of human history, this was the only reliable way to nourish infants. Mothers breastfed their children for years, sometimes until age 3 or 4, because it kept them healthy and protected from disease. But what if the mother couldn't produce milk or died during childbirth? That's where wet nurses came in. These were other women, often relatives, neighbors, or hired caregivers who breastfed babies that weren't their own. In many cultures, from ancient Egypt to Rome to medieval Europe, wet nursing was a respected and sometimes highly paid profession. Still, there were cases where no wet nurse was available. People then turned to primitive feeding vessels. Archaeologists have found small clay pots and animal horn bottles with tiny spouts, sometimes filled with animal milk or softened grain mush.
Some were shaped like animals or had narrow spouts to let babies suck, an early form of the bottle. Of course, these alternatives were risky. Animal milk carried diseases, and feeding vessels were hard to keep clean. Many infants didn't survive without breastfeeding, which shows just how crucial mothers and wet nurses were in ancient societies. In some cultures, babies were fed pre-chewed food. Mothers or caretakers chewed grains, roots, or meat into a soft paste, then passed it to the child, a practice still remembered in some traditional communities. Feeding a baby in ancient times was never easy, but families did whatever it took.
Today, sugar is everywhere, in candy, soda, desserts, even bread. But for most of human history, refined sugar didn't exist. So how did people satisfy their sweet tooth in ancient times? The first and most obvious answer, honey. For thousands of years, honey was the primary sweetener across the world. Ancient Egyptians kept beehives along the Nile as early as 2400 BC. Greeks called honey the food of the gods. In India, honey was not only eaten but also used in medicine and rituals. Harvesting it wasn't easy. It meant braving wild hives, smoke, and angry bees. Another natural sweet came from fruits. Dates, figs, and grapes were prized for their rich sugars. People dried them in the sun to concentrate their sweetness, turning them into early candy. In the Middle East, date syrup was a popular sweetener. In Greece and Rome, raisin wine and fig cakes were delicacies. Some regions discovered tree saps. Maple sap in North America was boiled down to make syrup and sugar. In the Mediterranean, carob pods were chewed for their naturally sweet flavor. Palm sap was tapped in Africa and Asia, sometimes fermented into drinks. Asia developed jaggery and rock sugar from sugarcane juice as early as 500 BC, though it wasn't widely available to the rest of the world until centuries later. Before that, most people had never tasted anything as sweet as modern sugar. So when ancient people wanted something sweet, they turned to honey, fruits, syrups, and saps. To them, sweetness wasn't an everyday thing. It was a luxury, often reserved for special occasions, festivals, or offerings to the gods.
Today, we take a pill for a headache or get anesthesia for surgery. But in ancient times, pain was part of everyday life. People broke bones, lost teeth, suffered injuries, and had to endure it without modern painkillers. So what did they do? The first defense was herbal medicine. Willow bark, used by the Egyptians and Greeks, contained salicin, the natural chemical that inspired modern aspirin. Poppies, cultivated in Mesopotamia, provided opium, one of the oldest and most powerful pain relievers. In China, cannabis and wine mixtures were used during surgery. Alcohol was another common solution. Fermented drinks dulled pain and calmed nerves, even if only temporarily. Strong wines and beers were sometimes mixed with herbs to create stronger sedatives. Some cultures turned to ritual and hypnosis-like practices. Shamans used drumming, chanting, and trance states to distract from or pull out pain. In India, meditation and breathing techniques, the roots of yoga, helped people control suffering in ways we now recognize as early pain management. For extreme cases, like surgery, people relied on physical methods. Patients were restrained, or pressure was applied to pressure points to numb certain areas. In some places, cold, snow, ice, or cold water was applied to numb wounds.
the mind was also a powerful tool. Ancient warriors were taught to accept pain as a test of strength. Cultural beliefs often framed pain as part of destiny, making it psychologically more bearable. Though crude compared to today's medicine, these ancient strategies, plants, alcohol, ritual, and mental training, laid the foundation for modern anesthetics and pain management. Humanity has always fought against suffering with whatever tools were available.
Before pharmacies and laboratories, the natural world was humanity's medicine cabinet. Plants were studied, harvested, and passed down through generations as cures for everything from fevers to stomach aches. So, how did people cure illness with plants? In ancient Egypt, healers used garlic and onions to boost strength and fight infections. Papyrus texts list hundreds of plant remedies, including aloe vera for burns and castor oil as a laxative. In China, herbal medicine became a vast system. Texts from over 2,000 years ago describe ginseng for energy, ginger for nausea, and ephedra for asthma. These remedies became the foundation of traditional Chinese medicine, still practiced today. In India, Ayurveda used turmeric for inflammation, neem leaves as an antiseptic, and holy basil for immunity. Many of these herbs are now studied and confirmed to have real medicinal effects. Europe's healers turned to local herbs like yarrow to stop bleeding, willow bark for pain, and elderberry for fevers. Monasteries in the Middle Ages carefully cultivated herb gardens, preserving this knowledge through centuries. Indigenous peoples of the Americas also had deep botanical wisdom. They brewed echinacea for infections, chewed coca leaves for energy and pain, and used tobacco in both medicine and ritual. But it wasn't only about the physical plant, it was also about ritual and belief. Healers often combined herbs with chants, prayers, or ceremonies, believing illness was as much spiritual as physical. Though not every remedy worked, many did, and modern science has rediscovered their value. Aspirin, morphine, quinine, and countless drugs trace their roots back to plants used by ancient healers. For early humans, plants weren't just food or decoration, they were life-saving medicine.
Toothaches are miserable, and in ancient times, they could be deadly. There were no dentists, no drills, and no anesthesia. Cavities, abscesses, and rotten teeth were common, and sometimes the only solution was to pull the tooth. But how did people do it? The earliest dentists were often barbers or healers. With no modern tools, they used pliers, forceps made of bronze or iron, or even just their hands to yank out teeth. In some cases, they tied string around the bad tooth and pulled quickly, or tied it to a door and slammed it shut. Before extraction, people tried pain relief methods. Herbs like clove oil, still used today in dentistry, were applied to numb the gums. In China, acupuncture was used to ease dental pain. Some drank alcohol or chewed narcotic plants to dull the agony. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, skulls show evidence of drilled holes in teeth, possibly attempts to relieve pressure from abscesses. Amazingly, some patients survived these crude procedures. If pulling was unavoidable, it was usually done quickly and brutally. Broken teeth were common, and infection afterward was a real danger. Honey, herbs, or wine might be packed into the socket to prevent rot. Superstition also played a role. In medieval Europe, people believed toothaches were caused by toothworms. Charms, prayers, or rituals were used alongside the painful extraction, hoping to drive the worm away. Despite the risk, pulling teeth was sometimes the only way to stop constant suffering. Without dentists, people endured unbearable pain,
until someone, somewhere, gathered enough courage and strength to rip the problem out.
Few things terrified ancient people more than plagues. When disease swept through a village or city, there were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no hospitals, only fear, desperation, and improvisation. So how did people try to survive plagues without medicine? One method was isolation. Even without fully understanding germs, many noticed that staying away from the sick reduced the risk. In biblical times, lepers were forced to live apart. In medieval Europe, plague victims were shut inside their homes or sent to quarantine houses, sometimes guarded by soldiers. Communities turned to ritual and prayer. Some believed plagues were punishment from the gods. Sacrifices, offerings, and processions were organized to beg for mercy. Others blamed evil spirits or curses, turning to shamans, priests, or magical charms for protection. People also used smoke and strong smells. It was thought that foul air carried disease, so homes were fumigated with burning herbs, incense, or sulfur. Doctors in medieval Europe even wore those famous long-beaked masks stuffed with fragrant herbs, hoping to filter the bad air. Herbal remedies were another defense. Garlic, onions, sage, and vinegar were consumed or rubbed on the body as protection. In some cases, these may have helped a little. Garlic, for example, does have antimicrobial properties. The wealthy often fled cities altogether. During the Black Death, nobles escaped to the countryside, leaving the poor behind in crowded, infected towns. Stories like the Decameron describe groups isolating themselves in villas, waiting for the plague to pass. And yet, for many, survival was sheer luck. Some people had natural immunity. Others avoided infection simply by chance. Without modern medicine, survival was rarely guaranteed. But humanity endured, adapting traditions and protective practices with each outbreak. Plagues were a reminder of how fragile life was and how much people depended on community, faith, and resilience when medicine could offer no help.
Today, we have drills, saws, bulldozers, and cranes. But in ancient times, people had nothing like that. So how did they manage to build homes, some of which still stand today without modern tools? The first houses weren't really houses at all. Early humans built shelters from what nature provided: branches, leaves, animal hides, and bones. In cold regions, mammoth bones formed frameworks covered with hides. In deserts, people dug pit houses into the earth for insulation. As farming spread, people began using mud, clay, and stone. Bricks were molded by hand, dried in the sun, and stacked to form walls. In Mesopotamia, entire cities were made of mud brick, no hammers or saws required. Stone structures required more effort, but not always tools. Builders used leverage, ropes, and manpower to move blocks into place. At Stonehenge, giant stones were dragged on sledges, rolled on logs, and raised with dirt ramps. The Great Pyramids of Egypt were built with similar methods: ramps, pulleys, and thousands of workers coordinating every block. In timber-rich areas, houses were made of logs and thatch. Trees were cut with stone axes or burned at the base until they fell. Logs were stacked or lashed together with vines. Roofs were covered with reeds or straw, waterproofed with mud. Even without chisels and nails, people discovered ways to make structures sturdy. They used interlocking stones, weaving branches into walls, wattle and daub, or simply pressing clay so tightly it hardened like concrete. Building wasn't just about tools. It was about community effort. Families and neighbors worked together, raising homes in days. Knowledge of how to build was passed down, ensuring each generation improved the craft. So, without modern tools, people built homes with hands, ingenuity, and teamwork, creating shelters that, in some cases, have lasted for thousands of years.
Cold winters have always been one of humanity's greatest challenges.
Without radiators, electric heaters, or central heating, ancient people had to invent ways to keep warm and survive. The most obvious solution was fire. A hearth at the center of the home wasn't just for cooking, it was the main source of heat. Families gathered around it, and houses were often built with small entrances and low ceilings to trap warmth. Smoke holes or chimneys came later. Early homes often filled with smoke, which doubled as insect repellent. In some cultures, people dug earth homes or lived in caves. Underground spaces held warmth in winter and stayed cool in summer. In Siberia, Mongolia, and North America, many nomadic groups used semi-subterranean homes covered with soil for insulation. In ancient Rome, the wealthy had access to the hypocaust system, an early form of central heating. Hot air from a furnace circulated under raised floors and through walls, warming entire bathhouses and villas. It was expensive and complex, but centuries ahead of its time. Clothing and bedding also played a huge role. Furs, wool, and layered garments trapped body heat. At night, people slept under heavy animal hides or shared beds with family members. Body heat was nature's free heater. Some nomadic groups used portable stoves. The Mongols, for example, carried small iron or clay stoves in their yurts, burning dung or wood to stay warm on the steppe. And finally, people relied on design. Thick stone walls, turf roofs, and south-facing entrances maximized warmth. Homes were built to work with the climate, not against it. Surviving winter wasn't about comfort. It was about creativity, adaptation, and endurance. And without heaters, people found countless ways to keep the cold at bay. Today, we toss food into a fridge and forget about it. But in the ancient world, keeping food fresh was a daily struggle. Without refrigeration, people had to be clever or risk starvation. One method was drying. Meat, fish, and fruits were sliced thin and left in the sun or over a smoky fire. Removing moisture kept bacteria from growing, turning food into jerky, dried fish, or raisins that could last for months. Another technique was salting. Salt pulled water out of meat and fish, preserving it. Salted cod, hams, and cured sausages became staples across Europe and Asia. Civilizations fought wars and built trade routes just to secure salt for this reason. People also used fermentation. Milk turned into cheese or yogurt, cabbage into sauerkraut, and grains into beer. Fermented foods not only lasted longer, but also added new flavors and nutrients. In colder regions, ice and snow were natural refrigerators. Ancient Chinese and Persian elites stored ice in underground pits insulated with straw, creating early ice houses. In winter, food could be buried in snow to keep it fresh. Where ice wasn't available, people turned to cool storage. Underground cellars, clay jars, or stone granaries kept temperatures low and steady. In hot, dry regions, porous clay pots cooled food through evaporation when water seeped through their walls. Smoking was another favorite. Hanging fish or meat above a slow-burning fire not only dried the food, but also coated it in preservative chemicals from the smoke. Finally, people ate seasonally. Instead of keeping food for long periods, they grew, hunted, or harvested what was available at the time. Storage was limited, but knowledge of when foods ripened or migrated helped survival. Without refrigerators, people mastered nature's techniques: drying, salting, fermenting, cooling, and smoking to keep food edible long enough to survive.
Mosquitoes, lice, fleas, and flies were more than just annoyances in the ancient world. They spread deadly diseases and made daily life miserable. Without bug spray, lice, fleas, and flies, people had to get creative. One of the simplest defenses was smoke. Fires were not only for warmth and cooking,
but the smoke kept away mosquitoes and other biting insects. In many villages, small smoky fires burned all night to protect sleeping families. Herbs and oils also played a role. Ancient Egyptians rubbed themselves with oils infused with cedar, cinnamon, or frankincense, which repelled flies and lice. In India, neem leaves were burned or applied to the skin. The Greeks used olive oil mixed with aromatic herbs to keep bugs away. Clothing was another shield. In hot climates, people wore long, loose garments that covered most of the body, leaving fewer places for insects to bite. In colder regions, thick wool and furs naturally kept parasites away. Homes were designed with pests in mind. Ancient Romans installed mosquito nets over beds, and some African communities built houses on stilts to reduce mosquito exposure near swamps. Storing grain in sealed clay jars helped protect food from weevils and rodents. Ash and clay were used as natural barriers. Farmers dusted animals with ash to keep fleas and ticks away, while people rubbed fine clay onto their skin, both drying out and deterring pests. Even religion and superstition played a part. Charms, amulets, and prayers were believed to ward off plagues of insects when practical solutions failed. Despite their efforts, insect-borne diseases like malaria, plague, and typhus still devastated ancient populations. But the battle against bugs was constant, and the clever tricks people invented laid the foundation for natural repellents we still use today.
Long before ticking clocks and digital watches, people still needed to know the hour for farming, prayers, trade, and even survival. But how did they measure time without mechanical devices? The oldest and simplest method was the sun itself. People watched the length and direction of shadows to track the day. This led to the invention of the sundial in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, where sticks or obelisks cast shadows that revealed the passing hours. For the night, people turned to water clocks, known as clepsydra. These were bowls or jars with small holes at the bottom. As water dripped at a steady pace, time could be measured. Egyptians, Greeks, and Chinese all used versions of this, especially in courts and religious rituals. Another tool was the hourglass. By letting sand flow from one chamber to another, people could measure short intervals of time, useful in cooking, speeches, or even military strategy. In many cultures, candles and oil lamps were also timekeepers. Marks were made along their length, and as the wax or oil burned, people could tell how many hours had passed. But timekeeping wasn't just about tools. It was about nature. Farmers watched the movement of stars and constellations to know the seasons. The rooster's crow signaled dawn. Bells, drums, or horns were used in villages to announce specific times of day. Even though hours were not always precise, people lived by rhythms of light, seasons, and ritual. For them, time was less about minutes and seconds and more about the cycles of nature and community life.
In the ancient world, clothing was not something you bought in stores. It was something you made with your own hands. Every shirt, robe, or pair of pants started with raw materials taken directly from nature. The first step was finding fibers. People gathered wool from sheep, hair from goats, silk from silkworms, flax plants for linen, and later cotton from fields. These raw materials were cleaned, combed, and spun into thread using a spindle or spinning wheel. Weaving was the next stage. Using simple wooden looms, threads were crossed together to create fabric. This process was slow and required great skill. In many cultures, women spent much of their daily lives spinning and weaving just to keep their families clothed. Once fabric was made, it was cut and sewn into garments. Needles were made of bone or bronze, and thread came from plant fibers or animal sinew. Before scissors, sharp knives or flint blades were used to cut the cloth. Clothing styles were simple:
often just draped pieces of fabric held together with belts, pins, or knots. The Greeks wore chitons, the Romans wore togas, and Egyptians wore linen wraps. In colder regions, people layered furs and wool for warmth. Clothing wasn't only practical, it was also a symbol of identity. Certain patterns, colors, or materials showed wealth and status. Silk, for example, was so valuable in ancient China and Rome that it was worth more than gold. Making clothes was hard, time-consuming work. A single outfit could take weeks or even months to produce. But for ancient people, clothing was more than fashion. It was survival, culture, and art woven into one.
In ancient times, colorful clothing was a sign of wealth, power, or tradition. But without modern synthetic dyes, how did people color their fabrics? The answer: plants, minerals, and even insects. One of the most famous dyes was Tyrian purple, made from thousands of crushed sea snails. It was so expensive that only kings, queens, or emperors could afford it. In Rome, purple was reserved for the elite. It literally became the color of royalty. For reds, people used madder root, cochineal insects, or crushed berries. Yellows came from saffron, turmeric, or onion skins. Blues were created using plants like woad in Europe and indigo in Asia and Africa, both requiring complex fermentation to release the deep color. Greens were often made by mixing yellow plant dyes with blue indigo. Browns and blacks came from oak bark, walnut husks, or iron mixed with tannins. Dyeing was no simple process. Cloth was boiled in vats with the dye material and a mordant like alum, vinegar, or even urine, which helped the color stick to the fibers. The process smelled terrible but created brilliant shades that could last for years. Colors carried meaning. In Egypt, green symbolized rebirth, while in China, red was the color of luck and celebration. In some societies, bright clothing marked social status, while poor people often wore undyed, natural-colored garments. Though time-consuming and smelly, natural dyeing transformed plain fabrics into expressions of identity, wealth, and belief, all without a single drop of modern chemicals. In ancient times, colorful clothing was a sign of wealth, power, or tradition. But without modern synthetic dyes, how did people color their fabrics? The answer: plants, minerals, and even insects. One of the most famous dyes was Tyrian purple, made from thousands of crushed sea snails. It was so expensive that only kings, queens, or emperors could afford it. In Rome, purple was reserved for the elite. It literally became the color of royalty. For reds, people used madder root, cochineal insects, or crushed berries. Yellows came from saffron, turmeric, or onion skins. Blues were created using plants like woad in Europe and indigo in Asia and Africa, both requiring complex fermentation to release the deep color. Greens were often made by mixing yellow plant dyes with blue indigo. Browns and blacks came from oak bark, walnut husks, or iron mixed with tannins. Dyeing was no simple process. Cloth was boiled in vats with the dye material and a mordant like alum, vinegar, or even urine, which helped the color stick to the fibers. The process smelled terrible but created brilliant shades that could last for years. Colors carried meaning. In Egypt, green symbolized rebirth, while in China, red was the color of luck and celebration. In some societies, bright clothing marked social status, while poor people often wore undyed, natural-colored garments. Though time-consuming and smelly, natural dyeing transformed plain fabrics into expressions of identity, wealth, and belief, all without a single drop of modern chemicals.
Walking barefoot on rocky ground, hot sand, or frozen earth was painful and dangerous. That's why even in ancient times, people created shoes by hand, long before leather factories and shoemakers' machines existed. The earliest shoes were incredibly simple. Over 5,000 years ago, people wore sandals made from woven grasses, reeds, or bark strips. In colder regions, shoes were made from animal hides and fur, wrapped tightly around the foot with leather thongs. Leather was the most common material once people learned tanning. Hides from cattle, goats, or deer were softened by soaking them in water, smoke, or even animal brains, which acted as natural chemicals to preserve and toughen the skin. Once ready, the hide was cut into shape and stitched with bone needles and sinew. In ancient Egypt, sandals were woven from papyrus and palm leaves, while wealthier Egyptians wore fine leather sandals decorated with gold. In Rome, soldiers wore caligi, sturdy leather boots with iron studs on the soles for long marches. In colder places like Northern Europe, people made shoes from a single piece of leather, folded and stitched around the foot, often lined with wool or fur. Native peoples in icy climates created moccasins and boots insulated with grass or animal hair. Shoes weren't only for protection, they also showed status. Rich people had decorated footwear, while peasants went barefoot or wore rough, simple shoes. In some cultures, like Japan, wooden clogs, geta, lifted the wearer above mud and dirt. Even without factories, ancient people solved the same problem we face today, keeping their feet safe, warm, and comfortable, often with surprising creativity.
In the ancient world, clothing was precious. It took weeks to spin, weave, and dye fabric, so people didn't throw garments away when they tore. They repaired them by hand. The main tool was a needle, made from bone, bronze, or iron, and thread spun from plant fibers, wool, or sinew. With these simple tools, people could stitch up holes, patch worn areas, or adjust sizes. Every repair was done one careful stitch at a time. When fabric became too thin, people patched clothes with extra pieces of cloth. In some cultures, these patches even became part of fashion. In Japan, for example, the tradition of boro involved layering patches over and over, creating unique, quilt-like garments that lasted for generations. People also used darning, weaving new threads into the fabric to close up holes, especially in socks or tunics. This method not only saved clothing, but also made it stronger. In poorer communities, clothing was passed down from one person to another, often being mended dozens of times. Old garments were cut into smaller pieces, turned into children's clothes, or recycled as rags and blankets. Nothing went to waste. Wealthier households had servants or slaves skilled in sewing, while ordinary families relied on the women of the household to keep clothes wearable. Sewing was a daily, essential skill, as common as cooking. Without sewing machines, repairs were slow, but they taught people patience and resourcefulness. Every stitch represented survival, thrift, and care, proof that clothes were once treasures, not disposable items.
Humans have always loved decoration, not just for beauty, but for power, status, and spiritual meaning. But in ancient times, there were no jewelry stores. Instead, people made their own ornaments from whatever nature provided. The earliest jewelry was simple and natural. People strung seashells, bones, animal teeth, or brightly colored stones on plant fibers or sinew. Some of the oldest necklaces found are over 40,000 years old. As societies advanced, they discovered metals.
Ancient Egyptians, Mesopotamians, and Greeks crafted intricate pieces from gold, silver, and bronze. These weren't only accessories, they were symbols of wealth and protection, often inscribed with magical charms or prayers. In many cultures, beads were especially valuable. Glass beads from Egypt, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, amber from the Baltic. These items traveled thousands of miles along trade routes and were more precious than coins. People also decorated themselves with body art. Henna, natural dyes, tattoos, and scarification were forms of adornment that showed identity, tribe, or courage. Feathers, animal hides, and painted clay were used in ceremonies and rituals. Earrings, bracelets, anklets, rings, and hairpins were all handmade, often by local artisans. Even without modern tools, ancient jewelers managed astonishing detail, carving gems, shaping metal, and creating designs that still inspire modern jewelry. Jewelry wasn't just beauty, it carried meaning. A necklace might protect against evil, a ring might symbolize marriage, and a crown might display divine power. Decoration was as much about belief as it was about fashion. Even without stores, people found endless ways to shine, proving that the desire to adorn ourselves is one of humanity's oldest instincts.
For most of human history, there were no classrooms, no chalkboards, and no official teachers. Yet children still had to learn, not math problems on paper, but the skills needed to survive. Education in ancient times was practical and oral. Parents, elders, and community members were the teachers. Children learned by watching, imitating, and practicing the daily tasks of adults. A boy growing up in a farming village would learn how to plant seeds, herd animals, and build shelters. A girl might learn weaving, food preparation, and medicine making. Skills were passed down directly, often from parent to child, generation after generation. Storytelling was one of the most important teaching tools. Myths, legends, and proverbs weren't just entertainment, they carried moral lessons, history, and cultural identity. In this way, knowledge lived in memory, not in books. In some ancient civilizations like Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and Greece, formal education did exist, but it was mostly for the elite. Boys of wealthy families learned reading, writing, mathematics, and law. Scribes in Egypt, for example, trained for years to master hieroglyphs. Girls, however, were usually excluded from schools and learned domestic skills at home. Religious training was also key. In many societies, children memorized sacred texts, prayers, and rituals. Discipline, respect for elders, and obedience were considered just as important as practical knowledge. Play itself was a form of learning. Games, mock hunts, and small tools helped children practice skills safely before using them in real life. Without schools, education wasn't about grades, it was about survival, tradition, and identity. Knowledge was lived, not written, and every child's classroom was their home, village, and world around them.
Paper, pens, and notebooks are modern conveniences. But in ancient times, people still needed to record laws, trade, stories, and prayers without paper. How did they do it? The earliest writing surfaces were stone, clay, and wood. In Mesopotamia, scribes pressed cuneiform symbols into soft clay tablets using a stylus made of reed. The tablets were baked or dried to last for centuries. Ancient Egyptians wrote on papyrus, a reed plant that grew along the Nile. Strips of the plant were pressed, soaked, and dried to create sheets. They used brushes and ink made from soot and gum to write hieroglyphs. Papyrus scrolls allowed long texts to be rolled up and transported. In China, People wrote on bamboo strips, silk, and even bones. Oracle bones, usually turtle shells or ox shoulder blades, were inscribed with questions for the gods. Ink was made from natural pigments, and brushes crafted from animal hair. In Europe, before paper was widely available, people used parchment and vellum, made from animal skins. Monks in medieval monasteries painstakingly copied books by hand, illustrating them with gold and colorful pigments. Even in cultures without writing, memory and oral tradition were forms of recording information. Poems, songs, and chants preserved laws, stories, and history for generations. Without paper, writing was labor-intensive and precious. Each tablet, scroll, or manuscript represented knowledge, culture, and the effort of skilled hands. It reminds us that communication has always been a human priority, long before notebooks existed.
Today, a text or call takes seconds. But before phones, emails, or the internet, communication over long distances was slow, tricky, and often dangerous. Yet humans still needed to send messages quickly for trade, war, or personal reasons. One of the earliest methods was messenger runners. Ancient civilizations like the Persians and Greeks trained people to run long distances with oral or written messages. These messengers were fast, reliable, and sometimes even armed to protect their cargo. Signal systems were another solution. In China, smoke signals or fire beacons communicated alerts across mountains. The Greeks used hydraulic telegraphs, water-filled containers with hidden markers, to transmit military messages. Even drums and horns were used in Africa and the Americas to send messages across villages. Written messages were often sent with couriers on foot or horseback. Ancient Rome had the cursus publicus, a state-run postal system with relay stations, horses, and fresh riders, allowing letters to travel hundreds of miles in days. Seals, coded symbols, and wax stamps ensured that messages weren't tampered with. In some cultures, knots, beads, or colored cords acted as mnemonic devices, conveying complex information without words. Even pigeons played a role. Homing pigeons carried small notes attached to their legs in ancient Rome, China, and later in medieval Europe, delivering critical messages in times of war. Without phones, communication demanded creativity, trust, and effort. But despite the challenges, humans always found ways to stay connected, proving that the need to share information is timeless.
Today, cars, trains, and planes make long-distance travel routine. But in ancient times, journeys across hundreds or thousands of miles were grueling, dangerous, and slow. So how did people get around? The simplest way was walking. Nomads, traders, and pilgrims covered vast distances on foot, often carrying supplies or using animals to help with heavy loads. People knew the land intimately. Rivers, mountains, and stars were guides. Animals revolutionized travel. Horses, camels, oxen, and donkeys carried people, pulled carts, and transported goods. In deserts, camels were indispensable, capable of surviving days without water while hauling heavy loads. In colder regions, reindeer or sled dogs pulled sleds across snow. Waterways were equally crucial. Boats, rafts, and ships allowed long-distance travel and trade. Ancient Egyptians sailed the Nile, Vikings explored rivers and seas, Polynesians crossed vast Pacific distances using advanced navigation skills, reading the stars, waves, and birds. People also developed roads and infrastructure. The Romans built a network of stone roads across Europe designed for foot soldiers, carts, and horseback riders. Inns, way stations, and stables along the way made travel possible over long distances.
Travel was never easy. Travelers faced weather, bandits, wild animals, and illness. Journeys that today take hours could take weeks, months, or even years. Yet ancient humans pressed on, driven by trade, exploration, conquest, and curiosity. Without cars, long-distance travel demanded endurance, planning, and ingenuity, a constant reminder of how much we rely on technology today.
Before rulers, tape measures, and digital devices, humans still needed ways to measure land, build structures, trade goods, and cook food. But without standardized tools, how did they do it? The most basic method was body-based measurement. Hands, fingers, arms, feet, and even strides served as units. The cubit, widely used in Egypt and Mesopotamia, measured the distance from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger. A foot, a span, or a palm were common references across cultures. For longer distances, people used ropes and cords. Knots tied at regular intervals helped measure land, fabric, or construction materials. Surveyors could stretch ropes across fields to estimate size accurately, even without numbers or formal units. Scales and balances were also early measuring tools. Ancient merchants in Mesopotamia and Egypt used balances with weights made of stone, metal, or clay to trade grain, gold, and spices fairly. Even small children learned to balance items using these simple devices. In architecture and construction, humans relied on geometry and observation. Plumb lines, water levels, and sighting rods helped align walls, dig canals, or build pyramids. Without rulers, careful observation, repeated measurements, and trial and error ensured precision. Time and measurement were linked too. People used calibrated containers for grain or liquid, measuring land by the amount of seed sown or harvested. Measurements were practical, tied to everyday needs rather than abstract numbers. Even without standardized rulers, ancient humans found ingenious ways to measure, proving that necessity and observation often outpace technology.
Play is universal, but in ancient times, there were no store-bought toys, video games, or playgrounds. Yet children and adults still found ways to entertain themselves. The simplest toys were made from nature. Sticks, stones, shells, and bones were transformed into dolls, figurines, or miniature animals. Spinning tops were carved from wood, while balls were made from stitched animal skins or tightly wrapped plant fibers. Board games date back thousands of years. The royal game of in Mesopotamia and Senet in Egypt are some of the earliest known games. These games involved strategy, chance, and skill, sometimes even played in temples as part of religious rituals. Physical games were common too. Children played tag, races, wrestling, and hide-and-seek. Adults also enjoyed sports. Ancient Greeks invented the Olympic Games, featuring running, jumping, discus, and wrestling competitions. In Mesoamerica, the ball game wasn't just sport, it had religious and political significance. Music and storytelling were forms of play as well. Simple flutes, drums, and rattles were crafted from wood, clay, or bone. Singing, dancing, and dramatization entertained communities and taught lessons simultaneously. Even without modern toys, imagination thrived. Objects around them became props, challenges were created from the environment, and games strengthened physical, social, and cognitive skills. Play was never about luxury, it was about creativity, learning, and joy.
Music has always been a part of human life. Yet in ancient times, many people sang without instruments, relying only on their voices. How did they make music, rhythm, and harmony without guitars, pianos, or drums? The simplest form was chanting and humming. Ancient cultures used repetitive chants for rituals, ceremonies, work, and storytelling. Egyptian priests chanted in temples, while indigenous peoples around the world developed complex vocal patterns for festivals and spiritual events. Body percussion was another technique. Hands, feet, and claps became natural instruments. People stomped on floors, slapped their thighs, or snapped fingers to create rhythm, accompanying songs or dances. Even without tools, humans discovered vocal techniques to mimic sounds of nature. Whistling, throat singing, and overtone singing were used to imitate birds, wind, or water, creating rich soundscapes. In Mongolia and Siberia, throat singing allowed a single person to produce multiple tones simultaneously. Songs weren't just entertainment. They preserved history, taught morals, and strengthened communities. Oral traditions relied heavily on melody and rhythm to help people memorize stories, laws, and genealogies. Later, simple instruments like flutes, drums, and rattles were added to enhance music. But singing alone was powerful enough to unite people, pass down knowledge, and express emotion. Without instruments, the human voice became the first and most universal musical tool, proving that music is deeply rooted in the act of singing itself.
Long before printed books, storytelling was the primary way humans shared knowledge, history, and imagination. Stories were told aloud, performed, and memorized, keeping culture alive across generations. Oral traditions were central. Elders and bards recited epics, myths, and legends around fires or in communal spaces. Stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Iliad, and the Mahabharata survived for centuries before being written down, proving memory and repetition were powerful tools. Songs, chants, and poetry helped preserve stories. Rhythm and rhyme made tales easier to remember. Even without paper, a child could learn family history or heroic deeds just by listening. Performances added drama. Storytellers used gestures, masks, puppets, and movement to make tales come alive. In some cultures, dances and theatrical enactments told complex stories of gods, animals, or ancestors. Symbols and art also conveyed narratives. Cave paintings, carvings, and petroglyphs told stories of hunts, battles, or daily life. For people who could not read or write, visual storytelling was just as powerful as spoken words. Without books, stories weren't static. They evolved with each teller, adapting to new generations. Every retelling strengthened memory, reinforced values, and entertained communities. For ancient humans, storytelling was survival, education, and culture rolled into one, proving that stories need not be written to be timeless.
Today, we sit in theaters or stream performances online. But in ancient times, entertainment was a communal experience, often without formal buildings or stages. So how did people watch shows before theaters existed? In early societies, storytelling and performance were outdoors. Villages gathered around fires, hillsides, or communal spaces. Actors, dancers, and musicians performed using gesture, song, and costume to convey drama to large groups. Rituals often doubled as entertainment. Religious ceremonies included dance, music, and dramatizations of myths, teaching moral lessons while captivating audiences. Festivals in Egypt, Greece, and Mesoamerica showcased performances blending ritual, story, and spectacle. Puppetry and shadow plays were another form. Ancient cultures in China, India, and Indonesia
manipulated puppets to enact tales of gods, heroes, and legendary battles. These mini-theaters were portable and accessible to anyone. Public spaces also hosted contests and spectacles, gladiatorial games in Rome, athletic competitions in Greece, and mock battles in Egypt were watched by thousands, turning sport into a dramatic, communal show. Even without theaters, shows existed in any place where people could gather. Firelight, music, costumes, and storytelling transformed simple spaces into stages. Performance was not about buildings, it was about connection, imagination, and shared experience.
Celebrations today often include fireworks, lights, and loud displays. In ancient times, though, people found other ways to celebrate, relying on creativity, music, and communal joy instead of explosives. Feasts were central. Large meals with roasted meat, bread, fruits, and fermented drinks brought communities together. Sharing food was a celebration in itself, marking seasonal harvests, weddings, or victories. Music and dance were everywhere. Drums, flutes, rattles, and body percussion accompanied dancing, singing, and chanting. Celebrations often lasted for hours or days, blending ritual, entertainment, and social bonding. Processions and parades were popular. Ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans staged processions with banners, masks, and statues of gods or leaders. These events were colorful spectacles, attracting crowds without the need for firecrackers. Lighting also played a role. Torches, braziers, oil lamps, and bonfires illuminated festivities at night, creating dramatic visual effects and drawing attention to performances, dances, or speeches. Special costumes, masks, and decorations enhanced celebrations. People adorned themselves with feathers, jewelry, or painted designs to signify status, honor deities, or simply make the event festive. Even without fireworks, ancient celebrations were vibrant, loud, and unforgettable, proving that human joy doesn't need modern technology, just creativity, community, and shared experience.
Long before grand churches, cathedrals, or temples, humans sought ways to communicate with the divine. Religion was deeply personal and communal, often taking place outside formal buildings. Prayer and meditation could happen anywhere, near rivers, under trees, on mountaintops, or at home. People used chants, songs, and rituals to appeal to gods, spirits, or ancestors. Sacred objects like stones, idols, or amulets helped focus their devotion. Nature itself was often worshipped. Ancient civilizations believed that rivers, mountains, sun, and moon held divine power. By offering food, drink, or symbolic gifts at natural sites, humans connected with the gods without constructed churches. Sacrifices were common in many cultures. Animals, grains, or symbolic items were offered to ensure fertility, success, or protection. While some rituals were small and personal, others were community-wide, drawing large gatherings for ceremonies and festivals. Shamans, priests, and spiritual leaders guided communication with the divine. They used meditation, trance, chanting, or hallucinogenic plants to interpret the will of the gods and act as intermediaries between humans and spirits. Even without churches, humans found countless ways to express faith, seek guidance, and honor higher powers, showing that spirituality is not bound to buildings, but to intention, ritual, and belief. Before modern coffins and funeral homes, people found practical and spiritual ways to handle death. Burial practices varied widely, reflecting culture, climate, and beliefs about the afterlife. Some of the earliest burials were simple pits in the ground. Bodies were placed in the earth,
sometimes wrapped in animal skins or plant materials. The grave might be marked with stones, sticks, or shells to honor the deceased. In colder regions, bodies were placed in frozen or permafrost soils, which naturally preserved them. In deserts, dry sand acted as a protective layer, preventing decay. Some cultures cremated their dead, turning bodies to ashes over fire. The ashes were collected in urns, scattered, or stored in sacred places. Fire was believed to purify the spirit and release it from the body. Elevated burials were also common. The ancient Celts and Native Americans sometimes placed bodies on platforms, in trees, or in mounds, keeping them away from scavengers and honoring them closer to the heavens. Grave goods were often included: tools, jewelry, food, and personal items to accompany the dead on their journey. These practices reveal a deep concern for respect, remembrance, and the afterlife. Even without coffins, ancient humans found ways to honor the dead, practical, symbolic, and spiritual, showing that care for the deceased is a timeless part of humanity.
Before modern science, statistics, and technology, humans still wanted to know what was coming for survival, decision-making, and spiritual reasons. They developed creative ways to predict the future. One method was divination. Ancient civilizations used bones, shells, or sticks, interpreting cracks, patterns, or positions as omens. In China, oracle bones were inscribed and heated. The resulting cracks told answers to questions about harvests, war, or health. Astrology was another widespread practice. Observing the stars, moon, and planets, ancient people interpreted celestial patterns as messages from the gods, guiding decisions about planting, marriage, or battles. Dreams were also considered prophetic. Shamans, priests, and elders would interpret dreams, believing that the unconscious mind or the spirit world revealed hidden knowledge. Animal behavior was studied for signs. Birds' flights, the movement of fish, or the behavior of livestock could indicate weather changes or warn of danger. Even simple coincidences were seen as messages from higher powers. Rituals and ceremonies were sometimes performed to influence the future. Offerings, chants, or dances weren't just symbolic, they were believed to alter outcomes and protect communities from misfortune. Without science, humans combined observation, intuition, and spirituality to predict the future, a mix of practical knowledge and faith that shaped decisions and culture for millennia.
Long before Galileo or Hubble, humans looked up at the night sky with wonder and curiosity. Without telescopes, they still observed, recorded, and interpreted the stars in meaningful ways. The most basic method was naked eye observation. People noticed patterns in the stars, tracking constellations, the moon, and planets. These patterns became guides for navigation, agriculture, and storytelling. The stars marked seasons, predicted weather, and helped travelers find their way at night. Mythology played a huge role. Many cultures created stories and gods from constellations. The Greeks saw Orion the hunter. The Egyptians saw sacred deities. The indigenous peoples of the Americas and Australia embedded lessons, history, and moral codes in the stars. Calendars were built from the sky. By tracking the sun, moon, and planets, ancient civilizations created solar and lunar calendars for planting crops, religious festivals, and civic planning. Stone monuments like Stonehenge and the pyramids were aligned with celestial events, showing precise astronomical knowledge without telescopes. People also noticed unusual phenomena like comets, eclipses, and meteor showers. These were often seen as omens, sparking rituals or storytelling to explain what was otherwise mysterious. Even without modern instruments,
Humans were astute astronomers, blending observation, mathematics, and imagination to explain the cosmos, turning the night sky into both a practical tool and a source of wonder.
Since the earliest days of human civilization, people have wondered what happens after death. Without science, evidence, or proof, beliefs about the afterlife were shaped by observation, intuition, and faith. Some cultures imagined the afterlife as a mirror of earthly life. Ancient Egyptians built elaborate tombs and filled them with food, treasures, and tools, believing the deceased would need them in the next world. Similarly, the Vikings placed weapons, clothing, and even ships in graves to equip warriors for their journey. Other cultures saw death as a spiritual transformation. Ancestors, spirits, and gods guided the soul to other realms. Rituals, prayers, and offerings were performed to ensure safe passage and favor in the next life. Stories of judgment and morality were common. In Mesopotamia, souls were judged based on deeds. In ancient Egypt, the heart was weighed against the feather of truth. These beliefs influenced behavior, encouraging ethical living even without scientific proof. Shamanic practices, dreams, and visions also shaped afterlife concepts. Leaders, mystics, and priests acted as intermediaries, claiming to communicate with spirits or reveal what lay beyond death. Even without evidence, thinking about the afterlife helped humans cope with mortality, maintain social order, and give meaning to life. Belief in something beyond the visible world is one of humanity's oldest and most enduring instincts.